Tonight, let me tell you about the most brilliant lie ever told. In 1943, British intelligence had a problem. They were about to invade Sicily, and the Germans knew it. When your enemy knows exactly where you're going to punch, you need something better than a good army. You need a corps dressed up with perfect secrets. This is Operation Mincemeat, the story of how a team of spies, con artists, and one very cooperative dead body convinced Hitler to move an entire army to the wrong place. Among those spies was a young naval intelligence officer named Ian Fleming, taking very careful notes. What he learned would later help him create James Bond. But tonight's story is stranger than any fiction. If you appreciate history with the propaganda peeled off and served with a twist of dark ingenuity, consider subscribing. This is a story about building a man from nothing, starting with the one thing you can't fake, a corpse. Now take a slow, deep breath, settle into the darkness. Let the real world fade as we open the scroll on how Britain won a battle with paperwork, theatre, and one very dead Royal Marine who never existed. Every brilliant con starts with an impossible problem. The problem was Sicily, that boot-shaped island floating in the Mediterranean like a stepping stone between Africa and Europe. By early 1943, the Allies had pushed the Germans out of North Africa. The next move was obvious. So obvious that even German intelligence, not exactly known for their imagination, could see it coming from a mile away. Sicily was the soft underbelly of Fortress Europe. Take Sicily, and you could bomb Rome. Take Sicily, and you controlled the Mediterranean shipping lanes. Take Sicily, and suddenly the Italian mainland was within reach. Every strategic map in every war room on both sides of the conflict pointed to the same conclusion. Sicily was next, which meant the invasion would be a bloodbath. The Germans would be waiting. Divisions, artillery, the whole murderous welcome wagon. Unless someone could convince them to look somewhere else. Enter the 20 Committee. The name was a clever bit of British wit. It was written as 20 Committee, as in double cross. This wasn't your standard military intelligence operation. This was where the British kept their creative types, the lateral thinkers, the men who'd been too strange for regular service but too brilliant to waste. At the centre of Operation Mincemeat stood two men who seemed pulled from a spy novel themselves. Ewan Montague was the face of the operation, a barrister by training. He possessed that particularly British superpower of lying with absolute, charming conviction. The kind of man who could tell you black was white while offering you tea, and you'd believe him because of the way his voice carried the certainty of the ruling class. In his tailored naval uniform, he looked exactly like what he was, upper-class respectability concealing a mind that worked in shadows and deceptions. Beside him was Flight Lieutenant Charles Cholmondeley, pronounced Chumley, naturally, because nothing in Britain is spelled the way it sounds. RAF Intelligence, the details man, the one who would lie awake at night wondering if they'd gotten the right kind of ink on the fake documents, or whether a Royal Marine officer would carry his handkerchief in his left pocket or his right. These two men, along with their small team, operated out of room 13 in the Admiralty building. The number was assigned randomly, but they liked the superstition. What they were planning required all the luck they could get. The seed of Operation Mincemeat came from a document that would become famous in intelligence circles, the Trout Memo. Written in 1939 by Admiral John Godfrey with considerable input from his assistant, Ian Fleming, it was presented as a fishing metaphor, a list of ways to catch enemy fish using various lures and deceptions. Number 28 was titled, A Suggestion Worthy of Consideration. It was grotesque, theatrical, and absolutely perfect. The concept was simple. Don't send a secret message. Have it found on a body. Make it look like an accident. A tragic drowning. A courier who died in a plane crash at sea. Let the enemy discover documents they were never meant to see. let them believe they've stumbled onto genuine intelligence through sheer luck. The Germans, the memo suggested, would believe documents found by accident far more readily than anything acquired through traditional espionage. It was reverse psychology wrapped in cold logic. The best cons work because the mark thinks they're getting away with something. But there was a complication, a rather significant one. They needed a corpse, not just any corpse. It had to be fresh enough to pass as a recent drowning. It had to be the right age, the right build. No obvious signs of trauma or disease, no identifying marks that might contradict their carefully constructed fiction. And perhaps most challenging of all, they needed to find someone whose death wouldn't trigger uncomfortable questions. Montague and Cholmondeley worked through the autumn of 1942, refining their plan with the obsessive attention to detail that separated good lies from brilliant ones. They mapped ocean currents off the Spanish coast. They studied the tides near Huelva, where they knew a particularly efficient German agent operated. They calculated exactly where and when to release the body so it would wash ashore at precisely the right beach, in front of precisely the right eyes. They drafted the documents. Not just one letter, but a web of correspondence that would paint a complete picture. Letters between generals discussing invasion plans, personal notes, the kind of paperwork that accumulates in the pockets and briefcases of men conducting the mundane business of war. But all of this was theoretical, architectural drawings for a building with no foundation. They still needed their most important raw material. In late 1942, Montague made a call to Bentley Purchase, the coroner at St Pancras. The conversation was delicate. They needed a body, but they couldn't quite explain why. National security. Hush, hush. You understand. Purchase understood. He also understood that in wartime London, bodies were not exactly in short supply. The Blitz had seen to that. But the requirements Montague outlined were specific, precise, troublesome. The body couldn't show obvious signs of violent death. It needed to be plausible as a drowning victim, preferably young enough to pass as a military officer. No family who would ask questions, no identifying features that might contradict whatever story they decided to tell. It was a macabre shopping list. But Purchase was a practical man living in impractical times. He said he would watch, he would wait. And when the right candidate presented himself, he would call. The team in room 13 worked through the winter, building their plan around a corpse they didn't yet have. They were creating a play with no lead actor, a con with no body to sell it. The pressure mounted as plans for the Sicily invasion accelerated. They needed their body. They needed it soon. And in January 1943, in an abandoned warehouse in London, death provided exactly what they required. His name was Glinda Michael, a homeless man, a drifter, someone the city had long since stopped seeing. He died alone, after eating rat poison, in a place where no one would hear him call for help even if he'd tried. When Purchase called Montague with the news, there was no celebration, just a quiet acknowledgement that they'd found their willing participant. A man who'd been invisible in life was about to become the most important man in the war. They collected him, they preserved him, they gave him a code name, Mincemeat. The con had its star, now they just had to write his script. The body sat in a metal canister in the basement of the Admiralty, packed with dry ice. Glinda Michael, who had died unmissed, was about to be reborn as someone else entirely. Someone with a past, a present, and a future he would never reach. But first, Montague and Cholmondeley had to answer a fundamental question. Who was this man? What was his story? Why was he carrying secret documents across enemy waters? They couldn't just stuff papers in his pockets and hope for the best. The Germans weren't stupid. They would examine everything. They would question every detail. The lie had to be perfect because the stakes were nothing less than thousands of Allied lives. In that windowless room, surrounded by maps and documents and photographs of a man who didn't exist yet. 2 British officers became novelists. They became method actors. They built a soul from scratch. And they started with the most important question of all. What kind of man carries his briefcase with him when his plane goes down at sea? The answer, they decided, was simple. A man in love. A man with something to live for. A man careless with duty because his heart was elsewhere. They would give their corpse a love story, and that love story would sell their lie. Every con has a human heart, a truth at its centre that makes the lie believable. But this con needed something more fundamental than truth. It needed a human, an actual body, and finding one proved more complicated than planning an invasion. The requirements were grotesque in their specificity. The corpse had to look like it had drowned at sea. No visible trauma, no signs of violence that a Spanish doctor might question. The body needed to be young enough to pass as a military officer in his 30s, fit enough to be plausibly on active duty, but not so distinctive that someone might recognize it. And perhaps most importantly, it had to be someone no one would miss. This last requirement carried a weight that Montague and Cholmondeley never quite articulated in their official reports. They couldn't just murder someone for the operation. That line, at least, remained uncrossed even in the moral wilderness of total war, which meant they had to wait. Wait for the right death, the right anonymous tragedy in a city full of them. London in 1943 offered plenty of anonymous deaths. The Blitz had seen to that. But most bombing victims were too obviously victims. Crushed by rubble, burned by fire, torn apart by shrapnel. Those bodies told stories the team couldn't use. They needed someone who died quietly, alone, unmourned. Bentley Purchase, the St. Pancras coroner, understood what was being asked of him without it ever being fully stated. He was a practical man in an era that demanded terrible practicalities. He kept Montague's requirements in mind as he went about his grim daily work, cataloguing the dead that wartime London produced with such efficiency. The call came in January 1943. Glinda Michael, 34 years old, Welsh, no fixed address, no known family, found dead in an abandoned warehouse near King's Cross, a building that smelled of old soot and older sorrows. Cause of death, rat poison, phosphorus-based, probably industrial grade, the kind used in the warehouses along the Thames. Whether he'd taken it deliberately or consumed it by accident while eating contaminated food was unclear. In the end, it didn't matter. What mattered was how he died. The phosphorus had caused liver failure. His organs had shut down slowly, painfully. But here was the crucial detail that made Bentley Purchase pick up the phone. In the final stages, fluid had accumulated in his lungs. Not much, but enough. Just barely enough to be consistent. If you squinted at the evidence and didn't ask too many questions with drowning, it was, as Purchase would later note in his private papers, good enough for government work. Montague and Cholmondeley went to view the body. It's one thing to plan an operation around a theoretical corpse. It's quite another to stand in a cold morgue staring at what had recently been a person. A man who'd walked London's streets, who'd felt hunger and cold, who'd made whatever choices led him to that warehouse, to that poison, to that lonely death. Glinda Michael had been invisible in life, the kind of person Londoners stepped around on the street without seeing. No family came forward to claim him, no friends appeared to ask questions. He'd lived in the margins of a city that had no time for margins, and he died there too, unnoticed until he became useful. In life, he'd been nobody. In death, he would become Major William Martin of the Royal Marines, the most important man in the war, a willing participant who would never know what he'd participated in. The team moved quickly. The body was transferred from the morgue to a secure facility. They needed to preserve it, not indefinitely, but long enough to build a backstory, long enough to plan the logistics of submarine transport, long enough to create a man from a corpse. They packed him in a metal canister designed for sensitive cargo. Dry ice surrounded the body, keeping decomposition at bay while they worked on everything else. The canister sat in a basement storage room in the Admiralty building, a secret so macabre that even most of the building staff didn't know what it contained. The team gave him a code name, Mincemeat. It was brutally practical, clinical, a way to create emotional distance from what they were doing. You didn't grieve for mincemeat. You didn't feel guilt about using mincemeat. It was just material, just another tool in the arsenal. But sometimes, late at night, when Montague worked alone in room 13, he wondered about the man in the canister. Who had Glinda Michael been? What had he wanted from life? What chain of failures and bad luck had led him to that warehouse, to that poison, to becoming the centerpiece of history's most elaborate con? The questions had no answers, and perhaps that was fitting. A man who'd been unknowable in life would become whoever they needed him to be in death. They would write his story, craft his personality, invent his dreams and fears and loves. They would give him everything he'd never had: purpose, importance, a place in history. All it cost was his name. The irony wasn't lost on Montague. In trying to save thousands of lives, they were erasing one, trading Glinda Michael's identity for the survival of soldiers who would never know his name. It was the kind of dark arithmetic that war demanded and that haunted the people who had to do the calculations. But the con required a sacrifice. Every good magic trick does. The lady in the box has to disappear before she can reappear somewhere impossible. Glinda Michael would disappear, and Major William Martin would appear in his place. The willing participant, who'd never had a choice, was ready. Now came the harder part. They had to make him real. They had to build a life so convincing that even death couldn't quite erase it. They had to create pocket litter and love letters and all the small human details that separate a body from a person. They had to become gods, creating a man in their own image, a man designed for one purpose: to lie so perfectly that the truth would save thousands. A con isn't about the lie, it's about the details, the small human touches that make fiction feel more real than reality. If Major William Martin was just a corpse with a briefcase full of fake invasion plans, the Germans would smell the deception immediately. They'd suspect a plant, a trap, the kind of obvious gambit that insults the intelligence of everyone involved. No, Major Martin had to be real. He needed a past, a present, and a future he'd never reach. He needed the kind of life that leaves traces, receipts and ticket stubs and angry letters and love notes, the mundane debris of existence that proves someone actually lived. In room 13, Montague and Cholmondeley became novelists. They became method actors inhabiting a character they'd created from nothing. They spent weeks building a soul from scratch, one carefully chosen detail at a time. They started with the basics: an identity card with a photograph they'd sourced from someone who looked vaguely like their corpse, or at least like what their corpse might have looked like when it was alive and healthy. A pass to Combined Operations Headquarters, a Royal Marines officer's identity disc, the paperwork that proved, officially, that Major William Martin existed. But paperwork alone wasn't enough. They needed personality, character, flaws. This was crucial. Perfect people are suspicious. A Royal Marine officer with a spotless record, impeccable habits, and no problems would set off alarm bells. Real people are messy. They make mistakes. They forget to pay their bills and get into minor troubles and leave their lives scattered across their pockets like breadcrumbs. So they made Martin human by making him careless. First came the overdraft letter from Lloyd's Bank. A stern, bureaucratic note informing Major Martin that his account was £79 overdrawn, and would he please remedy this situation promptly. It was perfect. The kind of embarrassing financial trouble that happens to junior officers who don't pay enough attention to their accounts. Not scandalous, just human. Then came the letter from his father, actually written by an MI5 clerk with a talent for capturing the passive-aggressive disappointment of British upper-middle-class parenting. The letter chided Martin for his financial irresponsibility, reminded him that the family name meant something, and urged him to straighten out his affairs. It was the kind of letter that makes you wince in recognition. We've all received some version of that parental disappointment, wrapped in concern and weighted with expectation. They gave him a social life, ticket stubs from a London theatre, the St James's Theatre to be specific, a production of Strike a New Note, a musical comedy that was popular that spring. The stubs were dated just days before Martin's supposed death, suggesting he'd been on leave, enjoying himself, living his life right up until the moment it ended. A receipt from a men's outfitters for a new shirt. The kind of small luxury a man might indulge in when he's in London with a bit of money and time to kill. It suggested vanity, or at least a healthy interest in his appearance. More evidence that Martin was real, vain, human. But the masterstroke, the detail that would sell the entire con, was the woman. What makes a man careless with classified documents? What makes an officer keep his briefcase close even when he should surrender it to proper security? What makes a person so distracted that they might fail to follow protocol? Love. They invented a fiancée. Her name would be Pam. They'd make her real enough that the Germans couldn't help but believe in her, and through her, believe in Martin. Flight Officer Jean Leslie of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force was approached with an unusual request. Would she mind if her photograph was used for a classified operation? She couldn't know the details. Naturally. National security. Terribly hush-hush. But they needed a picture of a nice-looking young woman to help sell a story. Jean agreed. Probably not fully understanding what she was agreeing to, they took a photograph of her, and she became Pam. Not Jean, not herself, but Pam. The imaginary fiancée of a man who didn't exist. But a photograph wasn't enough. They needed letters, love letters, the kind of breathless, slightly silly, wonderfully human correspondence that passes between couples in wartime. Letters full of longing and hope and plans for a future that would never arrive. They drafted them carefully. One letter had Pam demanding that Bill, Major Martin's first name, get a new photograph of himself for her to carry. It was a brilliant touch, explaining why his identity card would have a fresh, clear photo despite him being on active service. The letter was casual enough to feel genuine, affectionate enough to feel real. Another letter was more serious. Talk of wedding plans, her nervousness about meeting his family, her father's approval, all the ordinary anxieties of a wartime engagement, when couples rush to marry before deployment might separate them forever. And then, the final perfect detail, a receipt from a London jeweller for an engagement ring, purchased just days before Martin's supposed death. The receipt told a story all by itself. Here was a man who'd proposed, who'd scraped together the money for a ring, who was planning a future. A man so happy, so distracted by love that he might be careless, might forget protocol, might keep his briefcase with him even on a courier flight because his mind was on wedding plans and honeymoons and the life waiting for him when the war ended. The Germans would understand that. They'd recognize it. Love makes fools of everyone, even trained military officers. It was the most human detail of all, and the most convincing. They assembled Martin's pocket litter with the care of museum curators. Each item was aged appropriately, worn in the right places, creased where a man's wallet would crease it, marked with the kind of casual damage that comes from being carried around in pockets and pulled out repeatedly. The ID card went into a leather wallet. The letters went into an inside pocket. close to his heart the way a sentimental man might carry them. The theatre stubs went into a side pocket, crumpled as if he'd forgotten about them. The engagement ring receipt went into his wallet, probably looked at repeatedly. A talisman of hope. They dressed him in a Royal Marines uniform, complete with a trench coat for the journey. They placed a briefcase in his hand, or rather, chained it to his wrist with a chain designed to look secure but actually break away on impact. They couldn't risk the briefcase sinking or being swept away by currents. It needed to stay with the body, but not so securely that it looked suspicious. And inside that briefcase, the crown jewel of the entire operation, the reason for everything, documents. Official correspondence between senior British officers discussing invasion plans. Letters from one general to another, casual in tone but devastating in content. They spoke of an invasion of Greece, of concerns about Sicily being too obvious, of troop movements and supply issues and all the mundane, convincing details that make secret plans feel real. The documents were typed on authentic letterhead, signed by real generals who were in on the deception, and aged with the same meticulous attention to detail that went into everything else. They had to look like working papers, documents that had been read and handled, not fresh forgeries. The entire package, the man, the backstory, the documents, was a masterpiece of fiction, a novel written in 3 dimensions, where every detail supported every other detail, where nothing contradicted, where the story was so internally consistent that it couldn't help but feel true. In late April 1943, Major William Martin was ready. A man who'd never lived was about to die for his country. A man who'd never served was about to complete the most important mission of the war. A homeless drifter named Glyndwr Michael had been transformed into a Royal Marine officer with a fiancée, a future, and a briefcase full of lies that would change the course of history. All that remained was to put him in the water and pray that someone found him, the right someone, at the right time, in the right frame of mind to believe the most important lie ever told. The stage was set, the actor was dressed. Opening night was approaching, and in the waters off the Spanish coast, the Germans were waiting, though they didn't know it yet. The script was written. The costume was perfect. Now came the moment when theory became reality, when a plan drawn up in a windowless London room would meet the cold waters of the Mediterranean. The stage for this performance was carefully chosen, the coast near Huelva, Spain, not a random selection, but the result of meticulous intelligence work and cold calculation. Spain in 1943 was officially neutral, but neutrality in wartime is more of a spectrum than a position. Franco's Spain leaned toward the Axis. Gratitude for German and Italian support during the Civil War still weighed heavily. The country was a nest of spies from all sides, all pretending not to notice each other while reporting everything they saw. But Huelva had something special, a German agent known to British intelligence as being particularly efficient, particularly well connected, and particularly trusted by Berlin. The man had a direct line to German military intelligence. If a body washed up near Huelva with interesting documents attached, this agent would know about it, and more importantly, Berlin would know about it within hours. The British had done their homework. They'd mapped the currents, studied the tides, calculated wind patterns. They needed Major Martin to wash ashore at exactly the right place, looking exactly like a drowning victim, at a time when discovery was likely but not suspiciously convenient. The April moon and tide tables were consulted like sacred texts. The body had to be fresh enough to be convincing. Decomposition couldn't have progressed too far, but not so fresh that it was obvious he'd been in the water for only hours. The sweet spot was about a week of submersion, which meant timing the release based on when the body would be discovered, working backward from there. They chose April 30th for the drop. HMS Seraph, a British submarine, would carry their precious cargo. The crew was told they were transporting a top-secret meteorological device. It was the kind of vague, technical explanation that invited no questions. In wartime, every submarine carried strange cargo, and sailors learned not to ask what was in the sealed containers. But submarines are small spaces, and secrets have a way of making themselves felt even when they're not spoken. The canister was loaded aboard with unusual ceremony. It was large, cylindrical, metallic, roughly the size and shape of a man, though of course no one officially acknowledged that. The crew watched as it was secured in the torpedo room, treated with a respect usually reserved for munitions or royalty, and the cold. The canister radiated cold, the kind that seeps into your bones even through metal. Dry ice, of course, keeping the contents preserved, but it gave the sealed cylinder an aura of wrongness, of death contained and waiting. Lieutenant Bill Jewell commanded the Seraph. He knew what was in the canister. He had to execute the mission properly, but most of his crew didn't. They felt it, though. You can't share cramped quarters with death for days and not sense its presence. The conversations were quieter near the torpedo room. Men crossed themselves who hadn't been to Mass in years. The superstitious among them avoided that section entirely. The submarine made its way from Holy Loch in Scotland, travelling submerged during daylight hours, surfacing at night to run on diesel engines and recharge batteries. A week of careful navigation through waters patrolled by German U-boats and aircraft. The irony of it. A British submarine carrying a fake corpse to deceive the Germans, travelling through waters where real corpses were made daily. Montague and a Royal Marine officer, acting as official escorts for their manufactured colleague, spent the journey in a state of controlled anxiety. Everything depended on factors beyond their control now. Weather, currents, whether the body was found, whether it was found by the right people, whether those people would take the bait. April 30th, 1943, 4:30 in the morning, the Seraph surfaced off the coast of Huelva, approximately 1 mile from shore. The sea was calm, which was both blessing and concern. Too calm and the body might not wash ashore properly. But the tides were right. The moment was as perfect as they could make it. The crew was finally told what they were doing. Some had guessed. Others were genuinely shocked. All understood the weight of what they were about to do. They opened the canister. The smell hit first. Not overwhelming. The dry ice had done its job, but unmistakable. The scent of death, preserved but not prevented. Glinda Michael, or what remained of him, or what had been transformed into Major William Martin, was carefully removed from his metal coffin. They dressed him before sealing him in the canister. But now came the final touches. The briefcase was chained to his wrist. Documents were checked one last time. The letter from Pam was positioned in his inside pocket where a searching hand would find it. Everything had to be perfect because there would be no second chance. Lieutenant Jewell read the 39th Psalm. I will keep my mouth as it were with a bridle, while the ungodly is in my sight. I held my tongue and spake nothing. I kept silence, yea, even from good words, but it was pain and grief to me. The choice of psalm was deliberate. It spoke of silence, of secrets kept even at cost. Whether it was meant as apology or justification, no one could say. Then, with surprising gentleness, they lowered Major William Martin into the Mediterranean. The body floated, held up by the life vest they'd carefully positioned. The briefcase, chained to his wrist, floated alongside him. They'd thought of everything, including releasing a small life raft nearby, partially inflated, damaged, the kind of debris that might be found near a crash site. They couldn't stage an actual plane crash, but they could suggest one through careful set dressing. The current caught him slowly. The calculations had been precise. He would drift toward shore, toward the beaches near Huelva, toward the German agent who didn't know he was about to become the most important mark in the war. The The Seraph submerged and slipped away into deeper waters. Behind them, Major William Martin, a man who'd never lived, floated towards Spain and his date with destiny. A corpse carrying papers, a lie dressed in uniform. The most elaborate piece of fiction ever written, waiting for its audience of one. In room 13 in London, Montague could only wait. They'd done everything possible, every detail checked, every contingency planned for. Now it was out of their hands. The con was in motion, and all they could do was watch for signs that the mark had taken the bait. The sea cradled their creation, rocking him gently towards shore as the sun rose over the Mediterranean. Somewhere on that coast, a fisherman would soon have the strangest catch of his life, and in Berlin, men who thought they knew everything about the Allied plans were about to learn something that seemed too valuable to question. The perfect lie was afloat. Now they had to see if anyone would believe it. In any con, the hardest part isn't the setup, it's the waiting. Waiting to see if the mark takes the bait, waiting for the tell that reveals whether they've swallowed the lie or seen through it. And you can't ask. You can't check. You just have to watch and hope you've read the mark correctly. May 1st, 1943. Montague sat in room 13 and tried to work on other matters. Tried and failed. Somewhere off the coast of Spain. Their creation was either washing ashore or drifting out to sea, becoming nothing more than another anonymous casualty of war. Every hour that passed without news was agony. The first report came through intelligence channels on May 2nd. A body had been found, Spanish fisherman, near Puelva, exactly where the calculations had predicted. The local authorities had taken possession. First hurdle cleared, but the crucial question remained. Had the Germans seen the documents? The British played their part with perfect aristocratic fury. The military attaché in Madrid sent increasingly agitated demands to the Spanish Navy. A British officer had been found. His effects must be returned immediately. This was a matter of international law and common decency. How dare the Spanish delay? The protests were loud, official, and calculated to draw attention. Because if the British were that desperate to get the documents back, they must be genuinely important. The Germans, listening to every official communication, would take note. The Spanish authorities cooperated with agonizing slowness. Days passed. The body was examined by Spanish doctors who certified drowning as cause of death. The documents were catalogued. Procedures were followed with Mediterranean patience. And somewhere in that bureaucratic maze, the German agent in Huelva was doing exactly what Montague had predicted. He was photographing every document in that briefcase. The waiting continued. The briefcase was finally returned to British authorities on May 13th, sealed with Spanish official wax and accompanied by profuse apologies for the delay. Montague received it like a man receiving a letter that might contain either salvation or damnation. They had to know if the Germans had seen the documents without revealing that they knew. The solution was elegant. They would examine the documents with forensic precision, looking for signs of tampering. A specialist was brought in, one of those quiet men who notice things others miss. He worked in a laboratory, using techniques that would have seemed like magic to anyone watching. He steamed open the letters. He examined them under different lights. He looked for fingerprints, for fibre evidence, for any sign that the documents had been opened and resealed. And he found it. The letters had been removed from their envelopes. Carefully, professionally. Whoever had done it knew their craft. But they'd refolded the letters slightly differently than the original creases. The paper showed evidence of having been pressed flat for photography. Most telling of all, there was an eyelash that Cholmondeley had placed inside one envelope as a telltale. It was gone. The documents had been opened, photographed, resealed with such care that only an expert would notice. The Germans had taken the bait. But had they believed it? That was the question that kept Montague awake at night for the next 2 months. The Germans might have the photographs, they might suspect a plant, they might ignore the whole thing as too convenient to be true. The only way to know would be to watch German troop movements, to see if they reinforced Greece at the expense of Sicily, to wait for the invasion and see if the Germans were waiting for them. The signs came slowly, pieced together from ultra-intercepts, the British code-breaking operation that had cracked German military communications, references to Operation Husky, the Sicily invasion, but discussed with less urgency than expected, increased attention to Greece and Sardinia, panzer divisions moving away from Sicily, and then the smoking gun, a decrypt of a message from the German High Command to field commanders. The Führer himself had been briefed on the captured British documents. He was convinced the main Allied thrust would come at Greece, with Sicily as a feint. Forces should be positioned accordingly. Hitler had bought it. The mark, the biggest mark of all, had swallowed the lie completely. Montague allowed himself a moment of satisfaction, then immediately began worrying about the next problem. They couldn't let the Germans know they knew. The invasion plans for Sicily proceeded as if they expected heavy resistance. They couldn't afford to tip their hand by appearing too confident. But privately, planners began to hope. If the intelligence from that corpse was believed, really believed, the Sicily invasion might actually work. Thousands of lives might be saved, all because of a homeless man named Glyndwr Michael and the team that had turned him into Major William Martin. The weeks crawled by. Montague worked on other deceptions, other operations, but part of his mind was always on Sicily, on the invasion that would prove whether they'd succeeded or failed, whether their perfect lie had been perfect enough. July 9th, 1943, Operation Husky began. Allied forces landed on Sicily's beaches. They expected 15 German divisions. They found 2. The rest were in Greece, waiting for an invasion that would never come, waiting because a dead man had carried papers that told them to wait there, waiting because someone had believed in Major William Martin and his briefcase full of lies. The Sicily invasion was a stunning success. Allied forces swept across the island, meeting resistance but not the murderous opposition they'd feared. The soft underbelly of Europe had been cracked open, just as Churchill had envisioned. The path to Italy, to the eventual liberation of Western Europe, was open. In room 13, Montague received reports of the landing with something approaching reverence. They'd done it. The con had worked. Operation Mincemeat had been the most successful deception operation in military history. But success in intelligence work is often unacknowledged. The operation remained classified. The men involved went back to their regular duties, carrying the secret of what they had accomplished. The world celebrated the Sicily invasion, never knowing that its success had been purchased with an elaborate lie and the transformation of a homeless man into a hero he'd never know he'd been. The Germans never caught on. Even after the war, many German commanders insisted they'd been right about Greece, that the Sicily invasion had been a last-minute change of plans. They'd believed in Major William Martin so completely that they couldn't accept he'd never existed. It was the mark of a perfect con. Even after it's over, even after the truth is revealed, the marks can't quite believe they were fooled. They'd rather believe in the lie than accept they'd been so thoroughly deceived. And so we come to the end of our story. A story of deception, yes, but also of desperate ingenuity. Of men who understood that in war, sometimes the best weapon is a well-crafted fiction. That sometimes saving lives requires creating deaths, even if those deaths are purely narrative. Operation Mincemeat was declassified years after the war ended. Books were written, a film was made. The operation took its place in history as one of the most brilliant intelligence coups ever executed. Montague and Cholmondeley received recognition, awards, the kind of acknowledgement that comes to those who succeed in impossible missions. But what about Major William Martin, the man who never was? His story ended on a beach in Spain. The body was buried in the Nuestra Señora de la Soledad cemetery in Huelva, with full military honours. The Spanish authorities, perhaps understanding more than they let on, treated him with the respect due a British officer who died in service to his country. The gravestone the British erected told the official story. It read, William Martin, born 29th March 1907, died 24th April 1943, beloved son of John Glyndwr Martin and the late Antonia Martin of Cardiff, Wales. Dulciet decorum est pro patria mori. Sweet and fitting it is to die for one's country. The old Roman lie, as the poet Wilfred Owen called it, inscribed on the grave of a man who'd never lived under that name, who'd never chosen to die for any country, who'd been dead before his mission began, for decades. That was where the story ended. Major William Martin, Royal Marines, faithful unto death, the perfect fiction, maintained even in burial. But in 1996, researchers finally confirmed what some had suspected. The real name of the man in that grave was Glyndwr Michael, a Welsh labourer, homeless, no known family, dead at 34 from eating rat poison in a London warehouse. In life, he'd been nobody, one of thousands of invisible people that big cities produce and ignore. He'd left no mark on the world, no legacy, no one to mourn him. He died alone and unmissed in a building that smelled of soot and desperation. But in death, he became more important than he could have ever imagined. He saved thousands of lives. He helped change the course of the war. He fooled Hitler himself. This man who'd been invisible in life became, in death, the most visible missing link in one of history's most successful deceptions. The gravestone was updated in recent years. It now acknowledges both names, both men, the one who lived and the one who was invented. Glyndwr Michael served as Major William Martin, R.M. Two men, one grave, one real, one fiction. Which one mattered more? The man who died unmourned, or the fiction that saved thousands? The question has no answer, or perhaps has too many answers, depending on who's asking. There's a deeper irony here, one that Montagu himself recognised in his later writings. They'd created Major Martin to save lives, and succeeded. But in doing so, they'd taken a man who'd had nothing, no home, no family, no legacy, and given him purpose in death that he'd never found in life. Was it redemption, exploitation, both, neither? The man in the grave had no say in the matter. He died months before his recruitment. His consent was retroactive, assumed, impossible to obtain or refuse. The con was successful. The war was shortened. Thousands of Allied soldiers came home who might otherwise have died on Sicilian beaches. That's the clear moral calculus. But there's a shadow side to that calculation, one that's harder to weigh. A homeless man's identity was erased, replaced with a fiction, and even his final resting place bears a name that isn't entirely his own. Pam was real, in a way. Jean Leslie, whose photograph had made her into Major Martin's fiancée, lived a long life. She gave occasional interviews about her small role in a great deception. She spoke warmly of the adventure, the secrecy, the satisfaction of having helped. But she'd only been a photograph. She'd never written those love letters, never planned that wedding, never waited for a man who would never come home. The real tragedy, perhaps, is this. Glyndwr Michael saved thousands of lives and hardly anyone knows his name. Even now, when you read about Operation Mincemeat, it's Major Martin who dominates the story. The fiction is more famous than the truth. The lie lives on, more vivid and memorable than the sad reality of a homeless man dying alone. But he's still there, in that cemetery in Huelva, still lying under someone else's name, dressed in a uniform he never wore in life. buried with honours he never earned but certainly deserves. The ultimate willing participant in a con that required his willing participation only in the sense that he was too dead to object. The Spanish care for his grave. Even now, 80 years later, they plant flowers, clean the stone, maintain it as a site of historical importance. Tourists visit. History buffs pay their respects. The man who was nobody in life has become somebody in death, even if that somebody is mostly fiction. There's a lesson here, though what that lesson is depends on your perspective. Maybe it's about the price of victory, the moral compromises war demands. Maybe it's about how easily we erase people, how readily we transform the powerless into whatever narrative serves our needs. Or maybe it's something more hopeful, that even the most invisible life can matter, can change history, can save thousands even if the person who lived that life never knew their own importance. Operation Mincemeat proved that sometimes the most powerful truths are lies, that fiction, properly constructed, can be more convincing than reality, that the human need to believe in stories, love stories, hero stories, stories with meaning and purpose can be weaponized to change the course of history. The perfect lie was told, the perfect con was executed, and somewhere in a cemetery in Spain, the man who made it all possible rests under a name that isn't quite his own, having saved a world that never knew he existed. Sweet and fitting it is to die for one's country, even if it isn't your country, even if you were already dead, even if the story told about your death is as fictional as the name on your grave. Glyndra Michael, Major William Martin, the man who never was, and the man who was but no one remembered. Both of them rest now, in the same place, under the Spanish sun. Their shared grave a monument to the strangest truth of all. Sometimes the best way to save lives is to invent a death, and sometimes the most important heroes are the ones who never got to choose their own heroism. And with that, we close the case file on Operation Mincemeat, a reminder that ingenuity can be as powerful as armies, that creativity can save lives, and that sometimes the truth is best served by a lie. Sleep well, knowing that history is stranger and more human than any fiction. And if you dream tonight of Spanish beaches and briefcases full of secrets, well, at least you'll know the real story behind the man who never was.